Hello and welcome to another video where we're going to be talking about health, disease and medicines. Well, although we're not going to be talking about the medicine part just yet. So what we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be talking about pathogens. What we're going to cover is we're going to cover what groups of organisms include pathogens, talk about some examples of some common infections. We're also going to talk about the symptoms of those common infections as well. So let's get started by talking about the groups of organisms that we're going to cover in sort of today's session. So first off, we're going to have bacteria as one of them. We're then going to have fungus. We also have a section called Protists. And we also have viruses. So we have these four different groups: bacteria, fungus, protists, and viruses. Just a little reminder of a couple of these sort of to help you. Bacteria have all sorts of different structures, but sort of a similar one that you may have seen is the cholera one that we'll actually talk about in a moment. But you have structures such as slime and coats, you have sort of DNA in here, and we have flagellums on the outside. We then have viruses. Now, viruses are an interesting thing because technically some people debate whether they're living or not. They're not sort of like other organisms. Now, what we've got here, this is one type of virus, okay? Now, essentially the structures of a virus that you've just got to be aware of. We've got a protein coat on the outside, and that surrounds some DNA or genetic material. Because in some it's DNA, in others it's RNA. So viruses are a bit of a strange one, but we're not here to talk about each of those kingdoms and what they are. We're here to talk about the pathogens, okay, and some examples of them. So we've got these four different groups: bacteria, fungus, protists, and viruses. So let's zoom in on each one and talk about some examples of common infections within that group. So the first one we're going to look at is we're going to look at bacteria. So this bacteria here is a cholera bacteria. Now, cholera is not a very nice infection. Symptoms-wise, cholera has the symptoms of diarrhea. Now, you've got to be careful with the spelling of this. There we go. Diarrhea. Bit of an awkward spelling. Diarrhea is watery feces. Now, if somebody has cholera, what it can eventually lead to is it can eventually lead to dehydration and death. So when we're treating cholera, we sort of need to make sure that people are hydrated. Another example of a bacteria that causes disease is tuberculosis. Which is often abbreviated to TB. Now, what tuberculosis causes is some rather nasty symptoms of blood specked mucus, also causes some coughing, fever, and also some weight loss as well. Now, these two pathogens are different because they affect different parts of the body. Cholera infects the intestines, hence why one of the symptoms is diarrhea. Tuberculosis, that infects the respiratory system, hence why we've got blood-specked mucus that you might cough up, and also the association with coughing. Tuberculosis is also a fascinating one because you can get infected by tuberculosis and then you can get rid of it. And the infection isn't that bad, but then it can live dormant in your lungs for ages and then it can flare up again. Okay, so those are two examples of a bacteria that cause disease. What about fungus? Well, fungus is an interesting one because funguses sort of infect sort of humans and sort of you get, fungal toe infections and various other things. But where fungus becomes particularly sort of nasty is for plants. Now, plants tend to sort of have quite big epidemics of fungal infections. An example of one of these is called Cholera dieback. And what it causes is it causes lesions in ash trees. Now this is specific to ash trees. Now a lesion, okay, is lesions in ash trees. A lesion is basically a cut, a split. So what starts to happen is the bark sort of spreads apart a little bit. And it really hurts the tree, and it sort of looks all black, and it's not very nice at all. Okay, but there's lots of different fungal infections that will affect all sorts of trees, okay, but also fungus can also affect organisms as well. The next group we've got is protists. Now, protists are a group of sort of single-celled organisms that don't really fit into any other group. So this could be amoebas as one thing. Now, there is a protist that we sort of talk about as an example of this, and this is Plasmodium. Now, Plasmodium causes malaria, okay, and I'm going to put Plasmodium just in brackets here as well. So, Plasmodium. Now, this single-celled organism, what it does, okay, is it will get transferred between people by mosquitoes, and we'll talk a little bit about that next time round. Okay, but what does malaria do? Well, malaria infects the blood, and it also infects the liver cells. Now, what it causes is it causes fever, and also just a general weakness and sickness. And it's not a very nice condition to get at all. Hey, here's another one. Okay, on to the next group. So viruses. There are two viruses that we're going to talk about. One of them is HIV, and the other one is Ebola. Now, both of these have sort of been in the news an awful lot in sort of recent decades, because they have sort of severely affected certain parts of the world, and in fact HIV has affected across the whole world. Now, being aware of these two sort of conditions is really important, and they are both viruses. They're very, very different in what they do and how they affect people, but they are both within this group of viruses. So what about Ebola? What does Ebola do? Now, Ebola basically damages blood vessels, and what it causes is it causes internal bleeding. It is nasty, and it was in fact one of the sort of ones that caused an awful lot of concern a couple of years ago at the time of me making this video. Now, HIV, very, very different, okay? What HIV does is HIV attacks white blood cells. Now, some of you are probably already thinking, well, I know where white blood cells are from. They're from the immune system. And that's correct. And those white blood cells are what helps protect us from infections. Now, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, infects those white blood cells and prevents them from working properly. Now, if HIV gets hold in an individual, so the virus sort of gets a foothold and infects a large proportion of white blood cells so that they're not working anymore, what it can develop into is it can develop into AIDS, okay, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, what AIDS is, and I'll just change my colour ever so slightly here, okay, this is the point at which people's immune systems cannot fight off infections, okay, so it means that their immune system is vulnerable. Because their immune system is vulnerable, it makes them incredibly susceptible to what we call secondary infections. Now, those secondary infections could be something like tuberculosis. Now, normally your body would, with the assistance of drugs, be able to fight off that tuberculosis infection. However, if you've got AIDS, your immune system is at a point where it really, really struggles to fight those conditions off. So, for people who have AIDS, it's not the AIDS that kills them. It will be something like the common cold or flu, which becomes potentially fatal to somebody with that condition. Okay, so what have we talked about so far? We've talked about The groups of organisms that include pathogens, so we've got bacteria, viruses, fungus and protists, and we've talked about some of those common infections: cholera, tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, Ebola and cholera dieback. Now, as in part of that, we've talked about the symptoms of each of those. Now, all of these have one thing in common. They have symptoms, they have, and we can't see them. No, all of these things have something in common, and that's their microorganisms. Now, interestingly, within our bodies, we have a microorganism fauna, okay, of all sorts of healthy bacteria. You've seen the adverts, those yogurts that talk about healthy bacteria. Now, there are some pathogens that are sort of hidden within you. In fact, there's one in humans that 50% of humans have in their stomach. Now, of those, 80% of people will be asymptomatic with regards to having this pathogen within their stomach. It doesn't affect them. However, 20% of people will end up with stomach ulcers, and stomach ulcers are sores within the lining of the stomach. So one of the things about all of these pathogens is that they are so small and tiny, we cannot see them. Okay, and that's one of the sometimes scariest things about pathogens, is that we don't know where they are, you can't see them, you can't tell whether they're on a surface. So what we're going to talk about in the next video is we're going to talk about how these pathogens actually get from one person to another. How are they transferred between individuals? Because all of these pathogens will contribute to diseases that we call communicable diseases. Okay, once the pathogen has infected one person, it can infect another person by certain means, and we'll talk about that in the next video. And then after that, we'll get on to some of the good news about how our bodies are protected against all of these pathogens, and how we as humans are developing medicines and practices that help us fight off these pathogens so that they don't infect people. Or if somebody gets infected, how we can treat those people. So it's not all bad news. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's awesome to have your support. And as always, I will catch you in the next video.